Okay, everybody. Good afternoon. Good to see you guys again. Hope you're doing really well and had a great weekend. This is our Monday, April 27th meeting of Critical Thinking there at Cal State Fullerton, 1 to 2:15 p.m. section. And, I'm just here a few minutes early just to get things rolling for anybody arriving, just in advance of the class meeting time. But welcome if you're here. And in a couple minutes, around 1 o'clock, obviously, I'll get started talking to you guys about the notes for today. We just have a couple of meetings left during the semester before the final exam. So this week is all about Chapter 9, the topic of ethics. So we'll discuss that a little bit more today and Wednesday, and then next week we'll have a couple review sessions. So anyways, just hanging in there until it's 1. You can see my cat's enjoying the morning. She's being a good kitty. So welcome back. Good to see you guys. Anybody watching this live or watching it at a later time, hope you're doing really good. What's up? Kitty, you're such you want to be on the camera, huh? She's so cute. It's okay. Yep, she's back. That's right. Hi there, Michelle. She really wants to be involved today for sure. She's been just getting into all the lectures, all the live streams. Internet Kitty. Hi, Kitty. What's next, Kitty? What are you going to do now? This kitty's funny. What's up, Kitty? As usual, anybody who ever has a question, comment, anything at all, feel free, throw it out there, and I'm happy to help answer questions or guide you through any of the topics as we do it. So, take every opportunity if you would like to interact, and that's always something that helps the lectures, helps the students Just a reminder. Just a few more minutes and we'll be right there at class time, 1 o'clock. She really likes to look at the camera. I mean, I think she's just studying her own image. All right, everybody, just 2 more minutes. What do you think, Kitty? Welcome, everybody, showing up. Feel free to say hi. It's always nice to know who's here attending the live stream. Good, Kitty. Hello, hey there, Eduardo, Michelle. Who else in the house? Anybody? Let me see. If you want, let me know. It's always cool. All right. We're down to the last minute, and then we'll just get underway. Kitty seems to be doing very well with the shelter in place. I think that she's, if anything, happier than ever, because I'm here constantly. She's very, needy in terms of she likes to get a lot of attention and everything else. So I think from her point of view, this is a nice experience. Hi, Thomas. Hi, Yai, Matt, and everybody else. Really good to see you guys this afternoon. As we reach, closer to the end of our semester of work in this class. So yeah, it's pretty much 1 o'clock. So I'll go ahead and get us resumed. Thanks everybody for being here. It's Monday, April the 27th. We're gonna just go over the notes today that we have to go over for chapter 9 in our critical thinking class. So basically what's left now in the semester is we have the 2 meetings this week that are both on chapter 9. So that's ethics. We're going to talk about ethics today and then again on Wednesday. Then next week, Monday and Wednesday, we'll have a couple of review sessions getting you guys prepared for the final. So I'll try to give you a clearer sense of the topics that might be asked, and we'll review them at that time next week. So I'll be also done with the grading of your most recent quiz pretty quickly here. I'm almost done, but I think they'll be able to be released after Wednesday or so. So I'll send an email to the class, definitely midweek this week, those grades will be done and you can inquire for your score on that. And then, you're turning in your last homework on Monday, next Monday, a week from today. So make sure that you've followed the instructions and checked out that assignment in Titanium where I sent you the directions on how to do it, the media critical analysis report. So yeah, that's the last homework assignment, and then there's the final. So anyways, today is chapter 9. It's part 2 of our chapter 9 material. We started on that last week on Wednesday. Today, we're gonna do one more installment, and then on Wednesday, we'll close this off and we'll finish this topic. So back to chapter 9, which is all about the subject of ethics. Okay, so quickly, I'll just try to give you a sense of, whatever, a little summary of what I covered last time as we talked about all this. So first of all, I just tried to define the topic itself, what ethics is all about, what ethics is. Ethics, the word refers to the theoretical study of morality and moral concepts. So whenever you're thinking about the moral, the concept of morality and related notions, you're dealing with ethics. So I asked you guys to sort of give me a sense of what phrases or words come to your mind when ethics is introduced, and we got a good list of different terms. So for example, people mentioned moral versus immoral, good versus evil, right versus wrong, just versus unjust, how a person ought to act as opposed to how a person ought to not act. So whenever all those things are being mentioned, discussed, or debated, whatever the case is, that is in the arena of ethics. And within ethics, there are three major categories of actions. So we talked about those two. First of all, there are some actions that are called morally impermissible. That means that it's wrong to do that morally, and it's not okay to do. And there's a whole bunch of actions that could fit the that description. For example, I don't know, murder, theft, rape, genocide, torture, whole bunch of stuff. Maybe cutting in line, or even like more minor things, you know, telling a lie or not keeping a promise. Then another category of actions are the actions that are called morally permissible. That just means that they're not wrong and they are okay to do, morally speaking. And that encompasses a whole range of possible actions too. So watching this lecture, I would say that's morally permissible. I don't know, let's see, I don't know, watching a movie, playing an instrument, helping somebody, giving time, money, energy for some cause. Any of those things could be considered morally permissible, but they are not only the actions that involve like noble self-sacrifice. They're also just the little random daily things that don't have any sense of moral blame attached to them. So like, I don't know, I'm wearing glasses for this lecture. I'm morally permitted to do that, but it's not necessarily an obligation, and it's also not something that really bleeds into anyone else's benefit too much. But anyways, that's just one given example. Now, a third category are actions that are called morally obligatory. And if you guys can remember, that's just a set of actions that are claimed to be things that you must do, and it would be wrong to not do them. So I don't know, the keeping of promises. Here's another example. If you went out and you ate some food somewhere, well, nowadays we really can't do that as much, but say, for example, that restaurants reopen and a person goes and they sit down and they order a meal and they eat it. Do you think they have a moral obligation to pay the tab at the end? I would say yes, that's both a moral and a legal obligation, because it's an understanding of the transaction involving you receiving the food that you're going to be compensating the establishment for the labor and the materials and the ingredients they had to use to serve you. So look, there are some things that are moral obligations. Those are not optional, but mandatory actions morally. Then there are some actions that are just permitted, but they're not necessarily mandated. That's morally permissible. And then there are actions that are fundamentally just wrong. Also, we said that in case there's an immoral action, a morally impermissible action, you have a moral obligation not to perform it. So you have a moral obligation not to, I don't know, commit murder, for example. And not doing something that's morally obligatory is impermissible. So if you don't keep your promise, because your promise is a moral obligation, the not keeping of it, the breaking of it, in other words, would be impermissible. Okay, so then just bringing in that taxonomy of terms pertaining to ethics, we started with that. I talked to you guys about what moral reasoning is, and that's when you are the moral judge that makes a decision about what you think is right or wrong, or about what's you should or shouldn't do. Also, one point to remember, we distinguish between the concept of morality and legality. Although there's a lot of overlap between the two, it certainly is possible for an action to be morally obligatory or permissible, but yet illegal if the law itself is unjust. And it's also possible for an act to be morally impermissible, but legal. So you can have illegal actions that are not wrong. You can have legal actions that are wrong, and it just depends on the example. As an example, slavery was a legal institution, was legal at one point, clearly, before the Civil War and the 14th Amendment. But even during the time it was legal, I think it would be fair to say that it was unethical and immoral. To treat a human being as though they're property. It's not like there's no moral basis for that, because we're all equal, and our innate tendencies and human traits are not just skin deep. So anyway, you could say that slavery at a time when it was legal was still immoral, or you could say the freeing of slaves at that time, which would have been considered a crime, was not actually immoral, but even a moral obligation, perhaps. Okay, so just a reminder that morality and the law can sometimes diverge, but we would hope that they converge in most cases, right? Okay, so after this, we also just discussed two different types of values, moral values, contrasted against non-moral values. The moral values are values that are both beneficial to you, but also to other people, and they're considered good for their own sake, in and of themselves. So compassion, justice, mercy, forgiveness, altruism, those could be considered moral values. The kind of values that inspire and motivate a person's behavior, but when they're displayed, they benefit the other person who's treated that way, but also they benefit you, the holder of such a beneficent quality. And furthermore, whether they lead to a productive outcome or not, they're usually just thought of as good things, regardless of the outcome. On the other hand, there are non-moral values. Those are more goal-oriented values, values that just serve as a means to an end. And the end is often just personal happiness or satisfaction. So those include things like fame, wealth, popularity, or prestige. Those are not really directed at others and their benefit, but rather the self-interest that you have. And of course, we're motivated a lot of times by these non-moral values because we're seeking the benefit that comes from having wealth or fame or popularity. But it's mentioned in the book, and I think we talked about that it's good for you to have a solid dose of those moral values in your life and in your motivations as well, because it's something that actually does contribute to a deeper sense of abiding contentment and self-satisfaction with your own person. So there's kind of a built-in benefit to you, even though it is on the basis of not just benefiting yourself, but also other people. Okay, now from there, I just wanted to go through continuing more of the terms that we've all talked about, or that we've all read about, I should say, in chapter 9. So the next term that's mentioned here is the concept of the conscience. Okay. Conscience. What is the conscience? So this is not the same word as consciousness. Consciousness just refers to like the ability to perceive anything. So like, I mean, you have consciousness, this marker doesn't, but we're not talking about that, even though the spelling is similar. It's a different spelling also, but I just mention this because a lot of times I notice that students confuse the two pieces of terminology. Like they'll think that having just the ability to perceive or think is the same as having a conscience. But a conscience has a moral sense, and consciousness is just like cognitive activity of the brain. So what is the conscience then? It's thought of as an innate source of knowledge about what is right or wrong. Okay, so an innate source of knowledge. Maybe the conjunctive version, right and wrong. Okay, rather more same basic thing, but I thought this would be a clear way to put it. So that's the definition. Conscience, it's this innate source of knowledge about what's right and wrong. So innate means that it's born within you naturally, at least in the ordinary course of your human development. So it's something that we can tap into, that we're kind of endowed with by nature in a sense. But just like other abilities that humans have, they can either be cultivated and nurtured or left to weaken themselves and die off. So take, for example, the fact that human beings have an innate capacity to learn language, right? Like, so a baby that's born doesn't have the ability yet to speak the language, but they have the tools cognitively, intellectually to acquire the language over time. Unless, of course, they have a severe enough cognitive disability that the typical inborn ability to do that is missing. But in the normal case, a healthy, human specimen is going to have that like capacity to learn language later. Now, at the same time, a healthy individual who has that capacity may not develop it if it's not nurtured by environment in the right way. So like by nature, you have an ability to learn language, but if the nurturing of that ability doesn't come into play in your early life, then you might not ever acquire it. There have been, for example, a couple of very weird cases of children that were born like in a completely wild environment without having like the proper kind of parental care to like even teach them language. So there have been like a couple of like feral children that grew up without even ever developing language, even though they had no like Down syndrome or cognitive disability. That like acquisition of the language, since it didn't get activated in their early life, it never really fully developed. So you can read, there's like case studies and interesting documentaries about individuals who had that experience. What I'm telling you then is that the conscience is kind of similar in the sense that yes, you have this innate born ability to distinguish between moral right and wrong, but if it's not activated and nurtured through a proper course of moral education and instruction in your early life, then you might not fully develop it. So it's something that we have within us, given by nature, at least in most cases. Of course, there's the case of like the once in a while psychopath, sociopath, who has like no conscience and seems to be able to do things and cause harm to people without feeling anything. But that's not the norm, thankfully. Otherwise, would be even more in fear of other people than we currently are. And since people do generally reflect a sense of moral sentiment, sensibility, that ordinarily gets developed, at least to some extent. So yeah, it's innate, but it can be nurtured, kind of like the ability to learn language. And what our conscience does is it alerts us to the moral nature of a circumstance. So if you did something, for example, that morally speaking, you regret, your conscience will let you know about that because it will kind of sting you with the bitter feeling of regret, just knowing to yourself that you did something wrong, even if nobody else discovers it or holds you accountable. So it's this inner voice that kind of guides you to the right action that would cause you to feel some type of negative emotions if you stepped out of line for morality, or that would make you feel a sense of positive approbation and approval if you did something that was consistent with your moral principles and sentiments. So effective moral reasoning, making choices and reasoning about what's right and wrong, what you should or shouldn't do, kind of requires that you at least listen to your conscience and take it seriously, try and allow it to guide you to the proper behavior. Now, what the conscience does, among other things, is it alerts us to these, and it establishes within us these moral sentiments. So that's the next piece of terminology to add to our discussion then. Moral sentiments. Okay, so moral sentiments are just emotions which alert us to moral situations and cause us to want to do what's right. So cause us to want to do what is right. So by listening to our conscience and following its commands and guidance, we're led into the awareness of our own moral sentiments. These moral sentiments, as you see, are just feelings, emotions, affective states, which reveal the moral nature of a situation to us. And again, they're not neutral about these moral situations. In the ordinary, well-adjusted, healthy human being, you're directed towards and guided towards the actions that are good. But these sentiments help to make you clear about what those right actions are and what you ought to do. So within the scope of moral sentiments, there's a few individual items. So I'm going to put a couple of them up here. And as you know, I have to keep kind of clearing the board to create additional space. So we have this term moral sentiments. Now, what are some of them? Okay. Well, one such moral sentiment mentioned in the book is what they call helper's high. Okay, what is helper's high? Well, it's a feeling and experience that you have when you help other people and then you feel good. So it's basically the concept of when you help other people and then feel good about yourself as a result. Okay, so there you see, when you help other people and then you feel good about yourself as a result, phrase used in this book is helper's high. So there's kind of this interesting aspect of, our form of life. It's also seen in other animals too, but just with concern to human beings, we're definitely social animals. We live in societies that we build. We are not individual elements that have no connection to other people. Now, certainly there are some people that are more or less social as individuals, but at the level of the species as a whole, take a look around you at all of the amazing inventions, technologies, structures that have been established by human beings specifically. It's us, right, that have built roads, highways, communication systems, computing systems that can use language to further advance human industry and human innovation. So we live collectively in societies. We achieve things as a species as a whole that we could never do as individuals, just let's say hunting and gathering and just looking for our own individual survival. So part of nature's mechanism that gets us to cooperate with each other and to do things that benefit other people and to build systems that we can all live together in unison and in a healthy and thriving society is this helper's high. So nature kind of provides for you this built-in reward mechanism for performing actions that are beneficial to other people. So like if you, donated time for a worthy cause at some cost to yourself, but for the benefit of a bigger goal, normally a person will feel some sort of reward from that. Me as a professor, of course, I'm compensated financially like anybody would be from their job, but I derive a lot of satisfaction from the thought, at least, that I'm having some small contribution toward a young person's education and their success in the future. So these feelings of positive affirmation and satisfaction that come from benefiting others, that's just one of the moral sentiments, and it causes us to want to be helpful. There's also empathy, which is the ability to imagine and relate to the feelings of others. So I'm going to put that here. Empathy. The ability to imagine and relate to the feelings of others. So that's another one of the moral sentiments, the ability that we have to have empathy or to be empathic. That means that you're not only concerned with your own individual person, but that other people, the struggles they go through, the achievements they maybe have on the good side, that you can relate to them and care about those things. That in a sense, when other people are miserable, hurting, disadvantaged, that you care a little bit at least about how they're feeling and you get a sense of that feeling for yourself. So being able to inhabit the emotional landscape of another person and then act accordingly, right? So if this person's suffering or depressed or something, and you feel like you can relate to their experience, then you want to do something to maybe rectify the situation. Or if another person is experiencing joy because of some amazing achievement or accomplishment, you're not just neutral about it, like, well, I didn't achieve it, so I could care less. You actually have the empathy, which allows you to tap into and relate to their own experience. So this connects us to other people a little bit. You know, we are now in a socially distanced world, but of course, we still care about other people, and we are not alone. So empathy is a two-way street. To the extent that you demonstrate and display this to others, you're also going to receive that same kind of recognition from other people. People generally respect those that take an interest in their lives and that have a concern with them. It's hard to find durable friendships, relationships, partnerships with other people that are not based on that fundamental empathy. So yet another important moral sentiment. And like we've said, these all kind of flow from an awareness of your own conscience, which in the best case scenario is going to be nurtured environmentally, even though it's endowed in us by nature. Okay, a couple more of these moral sentiments to follow. Next, I want to talk to you guys about what's mentioned in the book as moral outrage. Okay. Okay, now moral outrage. This is not that complicated. It's just any situation where you perceive something that you take to be unjust, and then you become upset because of that. So when you perceive some injustice and become upset. When you perceive an injustice and become upset, this is the concept of moral outrage. So, you know, living in the world, there's obviously, it's not all fun and games. There's a lot of dark and disturbing aspects of human life and society. And so there's oftentimes things that for you to get upset about, for sure. It could be something that doesn't have a direct effect on you, but you still see that it's wrong and you get upset on that basis. I don't know, think of the civil rights struggle that continues, but really kind of got jump-started a lot, at least in the modern era, in the 50s and 60s, Rosa Parks bus boycotts and all of that. You know, you could have seen, for example, the practice that existed at that time before the boycotts, where, you know, black citizens in the United States would be asked to give up their seat for a white patron if they were seated close to the front of the bus. Now imagine the psychological effect that has on society and on the members of society. If you're a black person being treated this way, it's like, what, I'm a second-class citizen, I don't deserve the same privileges and entitlements that other people have just on the basis of my skin color. Like, so why should I be a person who has to relegate the seat for another person? It seems like it creates a two-tiered, unequal society. Now, even if you, let's say, weren't negatively affected by that, like if you weren't black at the time, but a member of the majority class or whatever of society, you still could have experienced moral outrage just at the recognition that this is a fundamentally unfair practice. And then, you know, you becoming upset might lead you to action, activism, you know, organization or whatever. So moral outrage is something that we often can and do feel. It depends on your ability to witness and take note of injustices that happen in society. So we could go on and on the list of issues that people care a lot about, which, you know, motivate them to go out and speak their mind, protest, distribute literature, involve themselves in institutions or agencies that try to rectify these problems, whether it was global poverty, sexism, racism. I don't know, people could take an interest in animals, the environment. So there's a lot of things that people could form a sense of moral outrage about. And it's not a bad thing, right? Because it's the only way that our sensitivity to injustice gets exposed by the negative feeling you have when you observe or witness it. So that's moral outrage. It makes you want to do what you can, if you can do anything, to make some contribution towards correcting the outrageous injustice that you perceive. Now, similar to moral outrage is the idea of resentment. So I'm going to talk about that next. What is that? Okay, so as you guys know, this is all found in our book. I'm just walking us through what I thought were some of the highlight terms in Chapter 9. So as always, throughout our whole semester, you're invited to, and really you ought to, read the book in tandem with taking in these lectures. That's all for your own benefit. Of course, you want to do well in the class, right? And so having a look at the text, also viewing the lecture, taking your notes, all those things kind of come together to form the clearest understanding where you're going to perform well on the tests and so on that you really want to do well on. So anyways, back to this. Resentment is next. Okay, so now resentment is kind of like a close cousin to moral outrage, but there's a slight distinction. What resentment is when you yourself are the one who has been treated unjustly and then become upset. So it's just kind of a little more personal than moral outrage, because with moral outrage, you could just be an observer of an unjust action or practice that you're not personally negatively affected by it, at least not directly. With resentment, though, you are in the class of victims of the injustice. So you're directly harmed or disadvantaged by it. So yeah, that's resentment. It's when you yourself are the victim of an injustice and become upset. Okay, so, just utilizing the same example, I guess, for the convenience of the fact that it's all been presented. If it had been the civil rights bus boycotts of the 50s, you could have had moral outrage, say, for example, if you were like a white person in society that was upset and aggrieved at the evident unjust mistreatment of blacks. But if you had been a black person during that time, had been mistreated on the bus systems and forced to relegate your seat for a white patron, then you would have experienced the resentment that comes from you yourself being the direct victim of the discrimination and racist institution that existed then. So, resentment is felt personally, but moral outrage also hurts. It's just that you're not the one who's the direct recipient of the injustice, if that makes sense. Okay, so just a quick little additional term. I also wanted to quickly mention a distinction between two further moral sentiments, guilt and shame. Guilt and shame are sometimes confused with each other, but they have a slight difference that we should be clear about. So let's go over that one. Okay, so first, guilt. So this is a negative emotion, or this is a bad feeling that alerts us to and motivates us to correct a wrong. So a negative feeling that alerts us to and motivates us to correct a wrong. And then side by side with that, I'm going to define shame. Shame is similar, but it's a negative feeling that results from violating a social norm. Okay. Okay. So guilt versus shame. Starting with guilt. Guilt is a familiar experience to anybody who's ever done something that they regretted having done on a moral basis. So I don't know, maybe the person cheated in school or in their marriage or something, and they have this feeling in their mind like of guilt because they know that it was wrong to do that, and yet they still did it. So the guilty feeling, although it's not the best way to feel, is not a bad thing, because it's trying to instruct the person about the bad behavior they committed, and it's trying to steer them towards better conduct in the future, or even perhaps to make amends to try and rectify or correct the wrong. So, that's what guilt is. Now, some people don't like the feeling of guilt, of course. It's not exactly pleasant, because you have to kind of reckon with your own misbehavior or immoral conduct, and none of us are perfect, right? So each of us is subject to, a lapse into unethical behavior. But the thing is, if you respond to guilt by just trying to resist it and silence it, then over time you may become immune to your own bad behavior and you feel nothing. And that's not the way that anybody really wants to be. I mean, sometimes people say, don't give me a guilt trip. Why are you trying to guilt me and all of that? But the opposite extreme is bad too, of course. If you feel no guilt at all, what is that? That is a psychopath, like, a sociopathic person who could, let's say, even kill people or whatever and feel nothing, or even feel good about it. That's not the way anybody wants to live. It's certainly not the best way to spend your existence on this planet, being willing to do horrible things with no remorse. So nobody wants to be a psychopath, right? Certainly that's not in your best interests, and it's not a self-satisfying way to develop in life. So let's not go so far in defiance of the feeling of guilt that we cause ourselves to sort of shut down our moral sentiments completely and feel like we're at liberty to just harm people, injure them, disrespect, or treat them unfairly with no feelings of even a tinge of regret or guilt. Now, shame is different, though, because shame is a negative feeling, but it results from violating a social norm. So you could actually feel shame with no guilt if you violated a taboo or social norm, but you didn't think that you actually did anything what? Let me ask you that question, if someone could quickly state their sense of the answer here. How could somebody feel shame without guilt? If they did something that was not considered normal, but what? Why would that be? And can you think of a possible reason or case where a person would have the experience of shame, but not associated with any guilt? How could that happen? It can happen, but I'm just trying to see if you can think about it and give me your assessment of that. Under what conditions could a person, on the one hand, feel shame, but at the same time not feel guilt? Based on these definitions, we should be able to come up with that. So what do you think? The shame would come from the violation of the social norm. But if the person did not experience guilt at the same time, then that would be because even though they violated a social norm, they didn't think that it was what? So let me hear. What do you think? My question is, how can a person feel shame without guilt? And you see the definitions. So it's a bit of deduction. Omar, you say this. When someone breaks a norm, however, they don't really see it as a big issue and move on rather than trying to fix it. Close, but I like the basic premise that they did something wrong, but they don't see it as a big issue. But it's not just that they don't see it as a big issue. It's kind of in line with your comment, Walden, that although they did something that was considered abnormal and therefore in violation of a social norm, they didn't think that the social norm itself reflected moral facts. So they didn't think it was unethical. It was just weird or uncommon. Okay, so like, for example, if you go to certain parts of the world right now, there could be certain like indigenous cultures where the norm is something that has nothing to do with like with the Western style of dress. So like, how we dress out here in the United States and in California. But if you went like really far away into, let's say, an indigenous community that doesn't have, modern technology or et cetera, then maybe in that culture, the norm is to wear almost no clothing or to be almost in a state of nudity, right? Now you might touch down into that part of the world and see everybody looking at you and laughing, like, look at this ridiculous person with the t-shirt and jeans on, or, whatever the case may be with your outfit. And you might actually feel a sense of, I don't know, shame if you did, because you're feeling like, well, I'm weird over here. Like in this community, in this society, the way I'm dressed is considered to be totally funky and out of the ordinary. But you might not feel guilt, right? Because as much as it's not normal in that society to dress the way you do. It's not that it's really unethical either, because it's not harming anybody and it's not, creating a victim of any kind. So there can be cases like that. The textbook mentions the issue of people that are of same-sex orientation that are just openly declaring their sexuality in maybe some time or part of the world, still today, but these things are changing. It could be considered outside the norms that prevail for most members of society. So a person might experience shame if they thought the norm is to be in a heteronormative relationship and all of that, and to have children and a nuclear family. But they might not feel guilt if their sense is that, I was just born like that and I couldn't have chosen otherwise. So, there are all kinds of scenarios one can envision, either real or hypothetical, where someone could have violated a prevailing social norm, but not really thinking that they did something unethical or wrong. And that would be shame, but without guilt. Okay, so next up then, I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about a topic that's mentioned in the book after this, which is the development of moral reasoning that occurs in an ordinary person's life over a set of stages. So there was this researcher at Harvard who's a psychologist. His name was Lawrence Kohlberg, and he studied the issue of moral development in human beings in all different parts of the world. And he thought that he was able to identify a general pattern of moral development that he thought was kind of universal to human condition, which is seen in like all different world cultures. So he believed that there's essentially a 3-stage process of moral development in a person's overall life. If they reach the highest level of moral development, that is, there's 3 stages. So my goal next is to put here on the board what the 3 stages or levels of moral development are, according to Lawrence Kohlberg, the 20th century Harvard psychologist. Okay, so erasing this for now. We know it's chapter 9, so I can get rid of the header. And we're talking now about stages of moral development over a person's lifetime. So who talked about this? This was his name, Lawrence Kohlberg. And he was a Harvard psychologist who basically lived from 1927 until 1987, so 60 years lifespan. And again, as he studied the data and the evidence about the process of moral development, he thought that these were universal and seen in all cultures, even though cultures differ, of course, a lot in dress, music, religion, whatever. He thought that there was this underlying unifying theme that can be derived from the observation of various world cultures, so that there's a sort of similar pattern of moral development. Okay, so there's 3 levels to this. I'm going to go over one by one. So 3 stages of moral development. Okay, now, probably maybe you remember that way back close in the beginning of the class when we were doing chapter 1, we talked about the stages of a person's cognitive development, right? So starting from dualism, going to relativism, going then to commitment. We talked about the 3 stages of a critical thinking process, right? Experience, interpretation, analysis. So I don't know why, but it seems as though a lot of times academics and others prefer to express concepts like this in a sort of 3-part series. I don't know, maybe there's something about the idea of 3 that is easy for a human mind to comprehend, like in stories, you have beginning, middle, and end. So anyway, here we are yet again looking at a example of a 3-stage process that plays out over time, except now it's not cognitive development or critical thinking steps, but rather your moral development over lifetime. Okay, so going on to the first one. The first stage of moral development he refers to as the PreConventional stage. So this PreConventional so-called stage of moral development is the first and earliest one. And it's the most rudimentary and basic level of moral perspective that little children and so on would have. it's completely self-centered. So the idea of the pre-conventional moral outlook is that you think morality is all just about avoiding punishment to yourself. Okay, so that's the idea here. Morality is all just about avoiding punishment. Pre-conventional level of moral development, avoiding punishment. So when you think like about little kids, right? The number one thing that they seem to care a lot about in terms of doing the right thing or the wrong thing is just, are they gonna get basically in trouble? Is someone gonna tell on them? Is the teacher or the parent going to, put them on timeout or ground them or whatever the case is? When you're thinking about morality just in terms of your own liability to punishment or reward, then you're not really thinking about the effect that any of your actions have on other people. So at the pre-conventional level of moral development, a person might say, I'm going to follow the moral rules that people give to me, but why would I do that? Only because I fear for and I'm trying to avoid getting punished. But if there was no way for the person, for example, to be punished, or if they could do it without being caught or something, then they might not really care about what they had done, because to the pre-conventional moral thinker, the only real reason there's such a talk of morality at all is just the punishments that can be attached to behavior that people judge as immoral. So there's no real independent thinking yet about why you shouldn't act a certain way, aside from the direct impact that it would have on you, the individual. So look, one thing I want to mention about these stages is that if you do look at the textbook, they try and break each stage down into 2 subparts. But I just found that to be a little bit overly complicated for no real reason, because each of the stages kind of has one essential idea behind it. So I'm going to simplify things a bit and just give you these 3 stages as 1, 2, 3. Not like stage 1, part 1 and 2, stage 2, part 1 and 2, stage 3, part 1 and 2, which is sort of how it was described in the book. But in my view, that just adds unnecessary complexity and makes it more, difficult for a student to process the information. So pre-conventional stage of moral development, big takeaway, it's all just about avoiding punishment. It's totally self-interested. Sometimes when you do things that you think are right, you do them because you care about the effect that they're going to have on other people, not just you. So like, why wouldn't I steal something from a person? Well, because I recognize that that's their property and they have a right to it, and that would injure and harm them. But if you're at the pre-conventional level of moral development, you hesitate to steal just because you're worried about, maybe I'll get caught doing it, and if I'm discovered doing it, I don't want the punishment. So it's a very narrow-minded way of looking at morality. It's only concerned with the self. The author of the textbook tried to give a little visual graph, kind of crude graph, to give the reader a sense of what the priority is at each step of the moral development process. And to demonstrate or visualize this, he said, look at these 2 circles here. One is the bigger one is the smaller one. At the pre-conventional level of moral development, this bigger circle represents your concern with yourself, and the smaller circle represents your concern with others. You're really not too much concerned with other people, aside from the capacity they have to punish you if you step out of line of some established moral norms. But it's really only for your own self-interest that you're even participating in those moral norms and trying to adhere to them. It's called pre-conventional because the idea is this is before you even start thinking about the conventions of society and why they exist. You're just operating from a standpoint of the pursuit of individual self-interest and the avoidance of pain and punishment. Okay, but of course there's 2 more stages. So we're moving on now to the second one. After pre-conventional comes conventional. That's stage 2. So I'll erase this and we'll go over that. So the second stage of moral development coming next. It's called the conventional stage. So stage 2, conventional. All right, so your conventional stage of moral development is when your whole moral outlook revolves around wanting to fit into the norms and standards of society around you. So it's now all about trying to just fit into the norms because you want to be a part of the normal group. You don't want to be excluded from that. So you just want to fit in and be perceived as, the textbook uses the language, as a good boy or a nice girl. So let me put that here. One wants to fit in to the moral norms and conventions of their society. Society or community, in order to, why would they do that? Well, in order to be seen as a quote unquote nice boy. Sorry, I want to use their little terms. So good boy or nice girl. So there's our definition. The conventional stage of moral development is the stage where a person is trying their best to simply fit in. They want to fit into what's considered normal, or as the term indicates, what is conventionally considered normal at that place and time, in that society and point in history. So it's kind of like a big backlash against the initial pre-conventional stage, because in the pre-conventional stage, you really don't care too much about other people and their judgments at all. You just care about not being the one who faces a penalty or punishment for stepping out of some set of norms. But in this case, you want to adhere to the norms, not so much out of fear of punishment, but out of the desire for the approval and approbation that comes from being a normal member of society. So whereas in the first case, our two circles depicting me and the others had the circle of me much larger, that gets kind of turned on its head at the conventional stage, where now the circle depicting me is smaller and others is much bigger. What that little visual shows you is that at the conventional stage, it's all about everybody else. It's all about what they say is normal, what they say is proper or considered conventionally appropriate. And so you're just trying to glom on to fit into that bigger social system here. And that's the basis for this person's moral behavior and outlook. In the first case, it's mere self-interest and the avoidance of punishment that motivates the person's moral behavior. In the second case, it's a desire to conform and fit in to established norms and principles of normal behavior. That's what motivates the person at the conventional stage. But then the third stage is there for people who, let's say, make their full development all the way to the highest level. And so we'll put that next. By the way, the author says not everybody makes it all the way to the third stage. Like some people will just stall out at some previous stage of moral development. Like if you continue to have the moral outlook of a little child as you get much older, then you never graduate from thinking about ethics in a deeper sense than what's going to get me caught or get me in trouble. So some people, even in full mature years, are still thinking about ethics as like maybe pre-conventional children. And a lot of times by the time you're in your adult years, like early adolescence, college years, and so on, you get into the conventional stage. You're like, okay, well, there's just this society, I'm a part of it. I don't get to choose the rules, so I better play by whatever the moral rules and norms are, so that people recognize me as like a good, happy, functioning member of society. I'm going to be considered a good boy or a nice girl if I do that. Now I just want to fit in. It's not so much about the desire to avoid penalties, but the positive desire to fit in to what's normal. Now the third stage, though, is the post-conventional stage of moral development, according to Kohlberg's research. So the third one, post-conventional. So at this post-conventional stage of moral development, a person recognizes the existence of universal moral principles, and they apply those principles in their conduct, even though sometimes these moral principles that they apply will disagree with or differ from the standard views of the society that a person is in. So post-conventional takes the judgment of society into account, and it gives weight to that, but it also allows for the possibility that your moral principles will somehow contradict the judgments of the society that you're in. Okay, so post-conventional. One acts according to universal moral principles. Which sometimes can diverge from the norms of society. Okay, so it's all about now having kind of your own moral compass, but it's derived from a sense of what you deeply believe to be moral and immoral, based on universal principles that you can apply to your own conduct and the conduct of others. So at this level, the person is prepared to critique established conventions and norms that prevail in their society. Think, if you will, about abolitionists against slavery back during the time period of legal slavery. Those people would have been standing outside of the established norms that then existed, but because they thought they had a higher calling, right? Not just to follow the existing law, but to try and steer law and society in a moral direction, which impels us to abolish an institution that treats human beings and their labor as products that you could own, right? So in that case, the person says, though the conventional views of my society is that this is a legitimate practice that's always existed, that maybe has some basis in like scripture or whatever, if they had those views and that was the prevailing norm, the individual who's reached this highest level of moral development might think, well, you know what, I need to kind of be willing to criticize these existing norms and to even defy them because that's the right thing to do. So at the post-conventional level, you're willing to critique existing codes of conduct and moral behavior that current day exist in your society, but that could be changed. I don't know, there are all kinds of moral struggles and debated topics that exist in our society today. Gay marriage was just federally legalized over the last decade by the Supreme Court, but there was a big moral debate about that. Many people could have argued that although the norm, which has prevailed since the beginning of society till now, is that this is intended only as a monogamous relationship between heterosexual opposite-sex partners, that there's a principle of justice and fairness which compels us to recognize marriages between any two partners that share like that kind of bond or love. So, you know, this is where people find it possible to critique existing norms. So the stages of development, they proceed in that order, you know, starting with mere self-interest, just don't want to get punished. Moving on to, let me try to fit in, and whatever fits in, that's good. To the third and highest stage, which is, although a lot of times society is correct and I take their views by way of advisement, I still have universal moral principles, which in some cases may differ from, contradict the viewpoints that prevail in society. So remember these little circles that were drawn to kind of give a sense of the basic thrust of each stage. At the pre-conventional stage, the circle that represents me was much bigger than the circle for others because it's merely about me. At the conventional stage, the circle representing others was bigger than me because now it's all about fitting into the others. The third stage basically states through the visual that they've come into balance now in their equilibrium. So the two circles are of the same size. Basically now we have this kind of visual to look at according to the book. Me, others. Neither one more significant or influential than the other one. So the views that have been derived from my membership in society and its norms hold significant weight, but that is balanced and equal to the weight given to my own appreciation of universal moral principles that I'll legislate in a way which in some cases may contradict the views of society. You know, so there's a lot of people who have righteous opposition to established law and the views of society which affirm those laws. Some people in this country are pro-life. They think that abortion is unethical, and they'll, protest the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision or whatever. And that's a movement that some people have. Some people believe, like real big libertarians might say, recreational consumption of psychoactive drugs is a personal choice that the state should not interfere in. So they might have righteous opposition to the established, anti-drug laws. At any rate, once you start to be prepared to make critiques of prevailing wisdom in society on a moral basis, you're a fully developed moral individual at the post-conventional stage. Don't get it wrong, though. It doesn't mean that the person is like an anarchist rebel who just wants to tear down everything that has been established. It just means that they have the open-mindedness and judgment to apply moral principles in a way that sometimes will not square with the judgment of society or of other members. So that's the post-conventional stage. If I'm looking at a book one time, let's see what I can tell you from the book if there's anything extra. Okay. So yeah, stage 1, pre-conventional, fear of punishment, view your own needs as all that matters. Conventional, put others first, please and help others, maintain good relationships and earn other people's approval, conform to the norms. Post-conventional, obey useful, albeit arbitrary social rules, appeal to social consensus and majority rule as long as minimal basic rights are safeguarded, autonomously recognize universal rules such as justice and equality that are rational and logically consistent and reflect a respect for equal human rights and the dignity of each individual. And you can sort of see these circles here, right? This is the big circle of me, small circle of others, the other one that's opposite, and then the equilibrium shown there. So just from the book. All right then, so following that, just a little bit more before I'll let us end for today, and then we have one more important lecture on this stuff Wednesday, but then that's our last, lecture-based meeting before we just start reviewing. It talks about how in college, the age of you guys, you're exposed to all kinds of new perspectives, different moral outlooks, different moral assumptions. So it's a time for you to kind of test and challenge your received views that you've grown up with and to develop a little bit. For some people, that's kind of a crisis because it's hard for some to build up and establish an independent outlook on the world. It kind of sometimes seems like it's disruptive of what you've established so far. But we have to be willing to engage in a little bit of self-criticism and analysis to make better moral judgment. The textbook talks about a case study of interviewing college students at different levels in their educational process, starting with freshmen and then going all the way up to upperclassmen. And they presented this hypothetical moral dilemma for the students to consider. And there were interesting patterns that emerged from looking at the different grade levels. So here was a case that was given. Suppose there's a guy whose name is Joe who is an escaped fugitive of the law. So, he's on the run from the law and he's not turned himself in, right, for some charge that's out there against him. Suppose that you come to discover this and you're the person's neighbor. So you're like Joe's neighbor. You learn that he's a fugitive. Question, should you turn him in or not? What would be the right thing to do? Overwhelmingly, people earlier in college, closer to their freshman year, would answer in the way that the pre-conventional stage would indicate that, or maybe the conventional stage, but basically this was the often given reason. Yes, you should do that because that's just the law, and I should follow the law because if I don't, maybe I could be abetting this person and therefore be punished. But as people got a little bit further along in college, you start to notice more nuance and subtlety in the way they would reply to this question, what should be done about the hypothetical neighbor Joe? People at more advanced years started to ask these type of subtle questions, like, well, what's the nature of the charge, right? What is it exactly that he's being, apprehended for if he is? And furthermore, has he rehabilitated? Is he a productive member of society? What would be the better benefit, him suffering the penalty or him being free? So one's moral development and the level they're at can be revealed by the subtlety and the complexity that they bring to bear on moral questions. So it's not just necessarily a black and white issue, like the law dictates what's to be done, and if I don't follow it, then I'm bad because I'm breaking the law. So yes, I guess after that, the last stuff that's in chapter 9 has to do with what are called moral theories. And that's an important topic that takes a little bit of time to go over. Moral theories are different approaches to ethics that give us a sense of where morality even comes from. And there's two major types of moral theory. So I'm going to write about those for now, and then this is going to just continue on into Wednesday. But two main types of moral theory. Okay, so on the one hand, you have what are called moral relativism. And then on the other hand, you have what's called moral universalism. Okay, so what moral relativism says is that morality is not universal and objective. So basically, it's relative to something, and it can change depending on the person, depending on the society, or whatever. So that's one view. Morality is not universal or objective. Moral universalism's the opposite. So it says, no, morality is objective and universal, and it doesn't change from person to person, place to place, or from time to time. According to moral universalism, there is a universal moral code, which is objective, and that we can discover that moral code somehow. So morality is objective, and it applies the same way to all people, places, and times. So there is an objective, universal moral code that applies to all people, places, and times. It's the same for anybody, anywhere, at any time. Okay, now if that's not so clear at the bottom, I will help you, because I know it's a little illegible or running out of space. I'm going to type it in the chat bar so that that can be easily read. So I'm writing that, so I'm a little closer to the screen. Moral universalism. There's an objective, universal moral code that applies to all people, places, and times. So if you wish, you can look just at the typed written statement of that concept. So some people believe in relativism because of the fact that there's not 100% unified consensus around every moral issue. You know, so like, I mean, just to take something I mentioned a moment ago, what about access to safe and legal abortion in the United States? People that are pro-choice will say, of course, a woman should have the right to determine, you know, what happens in and to her body concerning her pregnancy, whether she wishes to terminate the pregnancy or carry it to term. Pro-life person will say that's immoral, that's unjust. Now here we have two different sides of one position. Is it right or not right to allow abortion? You might argue that because people disagree on this, there can't be one answer. There just has to be differences of opinion with no fundamental answer as to what's really the right thing. And that's something that we see in a lot of other cases. Is recreational drug use immoral? Are certain social policies that get debated moral or immoral? And and on and on and on. If you're a relativist, you think there's no correct, so to speak, answer. There's just, it's relative. According to some people or some societies, this is wrong or not wrong. And according to other people, it's not, and there's no factual answer to break the tie. But there are actually two different kinds of moral relativism. So I kind of want to just briefly touch on those two types. So there's two types of moral theory. They break down as relativism and universalism. But now if we, tunnel into moral relativism more deeply, you're going to see that there's actually two subcategories of this. So now, two different types of moral relativism. I'll just put that below here. So one of them is called ethical subjectivism. And then the other one is called cultural relativism. Okay, so the first type of moral relativism seen here, ethical subjectivism, what that refers to is the belief that morality is nothing more than personal opinion. So that's this position. Morality is just personal opinion. That's one type of moral relativism. There's just personal opinion when it comes to morality. Cultural relativism, though, says that although it's relative, it's not relative to the individual, it's relative to the culture or society that the individual is a part of. So they say that morality is based on cultural and social norms. Okay, I'm running low on the space here. So what I will do is I'm going to type that into the bar, if you don't mind. That'll help. So I'm just going to write it here, cultural relativism. So you see it there, hopefully, in the chat. I typed it out. The definition of cultural relativism. Morality is based on cultural or social norms. So there's actually, fair reasons to be critical of moral relativism. So I want to open with that, I guess, on Wednesday, since we're getting low on time today, obviously. But what we will begin with on Wednesday is just a quick discussion of what could be considered problematic about these different types of relativism. So like these are the two here. And then we will also have a much longer discussion of the types of moral universalism theory that there are. And we're going to speak about at least two. So moral relativism and moral universalism, moral theory day, that's all Wednesday. So we're going to talk more about these moral theories. We're going to talk about what relativism is, what the difference is between these two, ethical subjectivism and cultural relativism. And then we'll spend some more time talking about the big topic of ethical universalism. So we'll talk about two major theories in that field, utilitarian ethics and Kantian ethics. So we've got our work set out for Wednesday, but I think today has been a productive meeting. We covered a lot more in Chapter 9. And we're just down to the ethical theory stuff. That's what we'll finish with on Wednesday. So I'm just going to say to you guys, thanks again for attending and showing up and participating. I really appreciate that. I'm going to be done grading the recently submitted quizzes that you guys did, and I'll have the grades ready this week. So you'll definitely know them well before you submit your final homework on Monday. I'll let you guys know by Wednesday or maybe Thursday latest that they're ready, and then you can simply email me for your scores. Okay, guys, so any questions? If not, I think we're good to go for today. So have a great afternoon then. Take care, everyone. Stay safe as always. And I will see you back here on Wednesday then. Okay? Bye-bye, guys.